Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and in this week's show we will be taking a look at Litil Divil. This is one of those games I've wanted to cover for absolutely ages, probably a couple of years by now. I've mentioned it to so many people over the years on various forums and Twitter and stuff. I promise guys, this is it. I've done my best. We'll have to see how it turns out. For now though, let's go and see what's come out in this week's Amiga news. I've always got a close eye on new Amiga content, especially over on YouTube. I keep seeing all of this fancy hardware that pops up that I know I've really never got any sort of chance of seeing or even using, but I never know what might drop into my lap one day. This week a video by Retrocengo caught my eye. He spent a good 15 minutes showing off something he acquired, a CYBERSTORM MKII card, which has a 68060 processor on board. These things cost a small fortune, and honestly, they're like the Ferrari engine of the Amiga hardware, and you will definitely need an Amiga 4000 to run it. But watching the card being installed and tested with Frontier 2 just showed what a jaw-dropping bit of kit it is. I always use the same game titles to test how fast my cards are and what I'm using, and it's a great way to see faster frames, and Frontier is perfect for this as it runs like a dream. I'm sorry to say I still don't have a big box Amiga, and a part of me is a little jealous of Retrocengo. But for now, this is as close as I can get, so I'm mentioning it this week to share with all. I'm sure he'd appreciate a like or subscribe, so don't forget to sign up if you do watch it. And if I've any listeners with these sort of cards, please let me know. I'd love to know what sort of kit you've got and what you've done to test it out and show it off to other people, if you have it at all. This next news item isn't really anything new, but I was reading through a few Amiga news groups when I ran through a discussion about Dune 2. I'm a big fan of old school strategy games, and it will probably surprise you to learn that I never actually played this as a kid, and I've still not gone near it since. Might make for a great show one day when I finally get around to covering it, but in the meantime it would appear that Nova Coder has done a complete recreation of the game. This seems to be an open source and needs an AGA Amiga with a decent 68060 processor. Whoa, that is powerful. My head started spinning when I read that part. I know most listeners can only dream of having specs that high, but it's the fact that someone's gone back and remade this into something more modern that will still run on Amiga hardware, which is so amazing. It does use data files from the PC version, but if you have a Blizzard or Apollo accelerator, you are all set to go. I've nothing that will run this myself, so by all means, if you can let us know how it goes, I'd really be interested to find out if it's actually any good. I couldn't even find any YouTube footage online, so it's crying out for someone to do a show and tell. I think someone like 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast is the right guy for this, so if you're out there, Mark, and listening, please go and give it a go, because I'm really intrigued. Sadly, that's all the news there is this week, but it always surprises me that there's so much to even cover. The Amiga scene is huge. There's always something interesting going on in the background or on the horizon, and I'm convinced it's only going to get bigger and bigger. But for now, let's tackle something smaller with this week's look back at Litil Divil. Litil Divil is an odd one. I clearly remember being obsessed with it as a kid. I'd pore over it in magazines and was just completely blown away by its gorgeous artwork, which at the time I thought put the likes of Dragon's Lair to shame. I had very little chance of ever getting a copy though, as the CD32 just wasn't on my radar. In fact, I'm sure I was convinced this was only ever out on standard Amigas. Sadly, by this stage, I'd moved over to consoles and I would have only been around about 14, so it's not like I had the money to even buy any new hardware or a game like this. Again, I was around 14 at the time. So, for years, I kept obsessing over a game I never even got the chance to play. And it's only since starting the show that I've been able to go back to older titles and give them a good once-over. It's funny how rose-tinted goggles work, as this has become some way overblown in my mind as one of the greatest Amiga cartoon adventures. Then, just a few months ago, I managed to get my hands on Bitmap Books, A Gremlin in the Works. That's a sort of gameography, if I had to give it a name, and going through all of the development notes and Gremlin's company history, I was happy to find out that they had a whole section dedicated to Litil Divil. Now, bear in mind, I couldn't find anything anywhere else. This was such a huge game for that company, yet they've never really been interviewed about it. It's all in this book. Now, luckily, you can still pick up a copy today for around £30, and I definitely recommend it. I'm not being sponsored in any way, it does sound a bit like that, doesn't it? But I was really pleased with this book. It's great quality, it reads really well, and they found out all sorts of information. It's going to help us out anyway with future shows, so I definitely thought I'd give it a mention. I will definitely put some info into the show link, so go and have a look and go and buy a copy, go and support them. Also, during my research, I realised that Aaron from the Amigos podcast did a showing of this game a couple of years ago. This was for the YouTube channel, and one story he managed to dig up, I'm not sure from where, was about a competition winner. The suggestion was that this person came up with the idea for the game, presented it to Gremlin, and they would then produce it and come up with something. But thanks to this book, I have to say, Aaron, I'm really sorry that this is one of those stories that sounds good from a forum, from rumours and so on, but from everything I found out about it, I know for sure now that was all just a rumour. I've been wanting to cover this for absolutely ages, but no matter how hard I search from forums to YouTube and all sorts of magazines, it always seemed to be just out of reach. There just wasn't anything to discover. So this is my take on Litil Divil. It was published by Gremlin Worldwide. They did Disposable Hero, Harlequin, another one we'll do an episode on, Hero Quest, which we covered before, K240. That's a strategy game I really want to cover, but I'm having similar problems. There's no like historical notes or interviews anywhere. This was an in-house production done by Gremlin Ireland. That was back when Gremlin had offices all over the place. I think they even had one in the US though, I might be wrong there. They only did one more game, Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is that a take on some B-movie from the 60s? I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, Litil Divil came out in 1994. It was just on one CD for the CD32. There was no AGA or floppy disk version ever released. Now, it was a single player game and priced at £29.99, which was quite a premium, I'm sure. The coders behind it were Andrew McCabe, who only ever worked on Litil Divil, Thomas Rolfs, who did Plan 9 as well, graphics-wise, Aidan Welsh, who only did this, Bill Plunkett, another Plan 9 guy, and then finally the music was done by a huge team of people, Adrian Carless, Neil Biggin, Patrick Phelan, and between them they did things like Space Crusade, K240 again, Golden Axe, Zool 1 and 2, loads and loads of different titles. For all intents and purposes, Litil Divil was originally inspired by Don Bluth's arcade game Dragon's Lair. The initial push was for the game to be like an interactive cartoon, so it's no surprise they would focus on Don Bluth's masterpiece, but it turns out that none of the Gremlin team had much experience even developing such a game, and so it would be several long years before it all came together. Gremlin Ireland was responsible for most of the game's production, and the team on hand didn't have any experience with pixel art, So the whole production stalled for a good while until Aidan Walsh started at Gremlin. He then began to make a real push on the project. Already being an experienced artist and animator, he picked up how to do the pixel art very quickly, and Litil Divil soon resumed at a much steadier pace. I suppose it's one thing to have these big, lofty ideas, but it's completely different to actually put them into practice. If you played the game, you might notice that a lot of the graphical design does have a strong resemblance to the Heimdall games, but that was mostly because one of the code leads, Jero Carroll, had worked at Core before starting at Gremlin, so he had a strong hand in guiding the overall look. Talking of the design, some of the most impressive are for the main character Mutt, who has well over 1800 frames of animation. It's even crazier to think that so much work was actually done that it's estimated they dropped around the same number before the game's release. They really went all out. This sounds more like some CGI production than a normal cartoon. The biggest downside for the developers is that was such a huge task to take on, and the team does say that they regret making Mutt do so many different things, as it was just an awful lot of work that they ended up creating for themselves. For all of the animation, the main part was done in Deluxe Paint, with just a few standard Amiga tools to help complete the rest. Does make me wonder if any homebrew listeners out there might have a crack at something like that. I mean, it must be possible, because yes, they had a massive team, but with enough time and effort and a few people having a crack, you never know what's possible. One note I discovered for the development is how the game relies on lots of mazes. That's to be able to explore the Underworld, and Philip Plunkett, when looking back, says that they didn't do much in the way of gameplay testing or actual balance, and the game probably overused them. We will mention that in the review, but they are one of the game's biggest faults, to be fair, so he does have a good point there. Litil Divil also has quite the expansive soundtrack, and in keeping with the cartoon style, this came about because Pat Phelan was inspired by the likes of Tom and Jerry with its use of classical music. So all this really does is show that they really were going off in all sorts of different directions to at least surpass anything that the home market had ever produced before. Though, having said that, the game did receive some negative comments in the press, mostly about a lack of sound effects, with one magazine saying it only had around 30. But Neil Biggins was surprised by that when he saw the comment and states it was closer to 300. They really pushed to take advantage of the new CD format and packed it full to the brim with music and different sound effects. This was around a new and exciting crossover for media, as it was also the dawn of a new age for CDs, especially game music, as the new storage increases meant many more original tracks with better sounding effects across all the gaming markets. Litil Divil was in development for 3 whole years, which was more than most Amiga games at the time. But after so much investment from people in the company, and I suppose much higher up, all of the staff mentioned that Gremlin never once considered cancelling the game. The company just felt there was something really special about it, and being unlike anything else on the market, wanted to take the risk. As the development wore on, the Island studio were struggling with the game, especially towards the end, and even staff from Gremlin Sheffield were sent over to help and get it finished. It seems that no expense was spared. The main question for the company, if I could ask it, would probably be, was it worth all the effort? In hindsight, yes. The launch was highly successful, surpassing any of their sales expectations. Later on, Philips even paid them to create a CDI port to take advantage of the new system. Rather than stick to just a plain Amiga port, they used the extra time to add streaming video, streamlined some more graphics, and added an intro movie, none of which ever made it onto the Amiga. Work did begin on a sequel, as Gremlin wanted to release a 256 colour background version, which would include smooth shading and an almost painting-like design. The plan was to set the world in an isometric town entirely at night with over 20 backgrounds and lots of new animation. Surprisingly, they wanted to tackle all this again, But sadly it all fell apart as Philips didn't want a sequel, so with the funding all falling through, it was cancelled. It seems that for Litil Divil there were plans to release a SNES and Mega Drive version, which would have been 2D side-scrolling platformers. Now that does remind me of some of the Dragon's Lair disasters that came out. Thankfully none of that ever happened. Ports wise, it only ever came out on the Amiga, the PC and the Philips CDI. Welcome to the Underworld, where you guide Mutt, the bad luck Litil Divil, through the labyrinth of chaos to help retrieve the mystical Pizza of Plenty. Our hero takes a fateful step through the mortal portal to prowl 5 hellish levels of treacherous tunnels with more than 50 raucous rooms of gameplay. Beware of killer spiders, bottomless swamps, ferocious furnaces and crazed bartenders. Watch out! If you can't get Mutt to the Overlord, the entity and the servant will drag him to the torture room for a little fiendish fun. I'm cheating a little bit this week as that lot's taken straight from the game's description over on GOG. There's a full page intro in the manual that tells the story in full, similar to what I just mentioned before, and it even has a single comic book page with a few panels showing off Mutt picking the short straw and being sent into the Underworld. It's all played for laughs and there's a light sense of humour about it all, but once you start the game, the story sort of falls away as there isn't any sort of text or voices, just the visuals on screen. That's probably why they did an intro video for the Philips CDI version. You begin the game at the entrance to the Underworld with a stick in hand and face to face with a big green troll. He's standing out on a bridge over a chasm and a rather concerning wooden club in his grasp. What sets this apart from most other Amiga games right from the start is the high quality graphics. There aren't any HUDs or text with something like you'd see in an old Looney Tunes cartoon playing out on screen. Even moving around shows off how well Mutt is animated and every action flows from one to the next. The starting area does scroll too, especially when you walk to the right and across the bridge, but only once you manage to beat the green troll, with a little bit of wild stick combat. This is a good time to explain that Litil Divil is split into 2 parts, puzzles and action screens. These are the main way of exploring each part of the game, with a red 3D maze which links everything together. After exiting to the right from the bridge, you are flung straight into the maze, which has a mix of 2D and 3D scrolling, which is quite impressive for the time. You can move left, right, forward and backwards, and Mutt even interacts with items on the floors. The mazes are filled with many pitfalls to be jumped over, but you have to be careful as things like tentacles will come out of the walls to grab you and cause you trouble. There's a lot packed into these sections, so you will have to bear with me as I try to cover them all. To the top left is a square that shows off a moving map, displaying every section of corridor that you have to walk along, though there aren't any markers beyond the shape of the corridors themselves. In the middle is a score tally with an energy bar beneath the main play area. This in itself is a screen-centered rectangular box that follows the player, and there's even a key counter off to the lower right hand side. Again, the original opening movie-like scenes where you've got all the animation going on doesn't have any text or HUD, but when you get into the maze bit, that does. It's a very strange mix between the 2 halves. This is all surrounded by Litil Divil's spooky hellish theme with demon statues, glowing eyes and even death popping out of the top corner as you run out of time. I'm not even sure what I'm actually describing anymore. This is very bizarre. The game splits its controls as the main sections are far more linear, action orientated, whilst the cartoony areas involve running around a more 3D light screen that you can explore. So things like being able to jump between platforms to say avoid rivers of blood or devilish bubbles, and even interact with puzzles related to the actual room you're in. Every so often you will have to face off with a foe to do combat, and this consists of bashing them over the head with your stick and avoiding all of their attacks. These are all done by button presses that often require a lot of practice. One room might have you using action and a direction to jump, but another might change it completely depending on context of the room. It can be a struggle to get used to them at the best of times, as they don't feel very intuitive, but as you explore more and more and retry the rooms, it will become easier to understand. Puzzles are often solved by finding the in-game store and picking up different items to let you continue, most of which are based on the real world, so the head scratches can be done by most people, I'm sure. Think of a bug spray to take out a giant spider, just to get a good idea of the sort of stuff it throws into the mix. There's around 50 of these rooms to explore throughout the entire game, with some reusing graphics from earlier sections, but more on that in a little bit. Every so often, you will discover a dungeon room with a bed hidden away inside. Here you can save the game to at least come back at a later time, though this does make you restart the whole level at the beginning, so it's best to use them wisely. The dungeon floor is complete once you manage to find 3 different artifacts, so there's enough to keep even the most ardent dungeon explorers going, as each level has its own boss to beat in combat. This can be battles with demons holding maces or even crazy tennis games. It throws so many different things at you, it's really hard to keep a straight face throughout. There's a lot of humour mixed in here. The biggest draw for Little Divil has to be the cartoon-like animations, and especially those rich, detailed background art that Mutt can fully explore. Every part of the game feels like some classics 80s cartoon show, and I'm not even sure how they even managed to get the Amiga to do most of this stuff. Some of the larger expansive areas actually scroll around with the moving characters on screen, giving you a real sense of being in an actual world. Every movement of characters or actions have so much thought and detail added, it's as smooth as you'd hope with no slowdown, at least that I could see. With the art and animation, this might just be the pinnacle of Amiga visuals. Well, at least for 1994. With this being a CD32 title, it does take full advantage of the CD medium, and with what I thought was a stunning range of 10 different tracks. These aren't just poor quality 16-bit tunes either, they have instruments playing in the background and they sound like they've been done by a proper composer. I'm even sure there's an organ playing in some of these tunes. It's the sort of stuff you want the rest of the CD32 library to have, and it doesn't sound like they've done this on the cheap. Might not seem like much today, but I'm sure this would have been quite fresh for the Amiga in the 90s. I'm not one for musical compositions though, and I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to this on an audio level, but I've really not heard anything like this in anything we've covered so far. It's always nice to be pleasantly surprised by some audio. I mean, I really was taken back by how good it was. That also brings us on to the sound effects. With the music being handled by the CD drive, it's all left to the console's audio channels, left free to focus on decent ones. Every interaction on screen has a matching sound effect, from the soft thud of Mutt's feet on the floor to him falling into a pit and then grumbling away, glaring at you and banging the floor with annoyance. With this focusing so much on puzzles, there's a lot to be heard, and that 300 count done by Pat Phelan is even more impressive today. This really does stand out as an audio delight, with lots of voice samples scattered around with plenty of grunts and groans. That seems as good a time as any to lead us on to the game's issues. I'm not sure why, but there's not really any story in the game. They do a good enough job of setting the scene with some jokes thrown in, but it just falls away once the action starts. I'd have taken some poor quality voice recordings at this stage, but there isn't even any text prompts. All I can think is that it must have been a stylistic choice. It's a little odd to say the least, and it really does make the game miss out. Part of the game, when it comes to interacting with the environment, feels like it should be full of quick time events. The fights and actions on screen rely on you watching the animation, then using trial and error to work your way through. This is fine to some degree, but the controls aren't clever or done well enough to make it all work as quickly as it should. So you will often find yourself being bashed repeatedly or knocked about in spots that shouldn't be all that difficult to get through. The opening scene is the perfect example of this, as a bit of prompting with indicators might have helped with the battle, even though they just let you take infinite hits to help learn the gameplay. It just feels a little bit lacking. Considering this was years before the likes of Shenmue, it's understandable that they didn't think of quick time events, but this was based around Dragon's Lair in a way, so that does have them with the big dop-off arrow showing you which way to go. The next problem has to be the large number of red corridors to explore in the maze. I understand they would have been limited by what they could do, but filling hours of gameplay with the same 3D design to walk down over and over and over again can be a bit nauseating. With all the CD space that they had, I doubt it would have been much of a problem to load more visual or graphical data in. I get that it's set in hell, but it's a bit lazy and works against the overall experience. There's a map in the maze sections that has an arrow to show you which way you are pointing, but it's so small and really difficult to see. Keep in mind, I struggle with this on emulation on a razor sharp monitor, and this would have been way too blurry on CRTVs back then, making it all a bit pointless and useless. It should have been much bigger and much better, a lot clearer to see. There's also far too much backtracking at times. You need to visit a shop to buy items to help solve the puzzles, but this means walking constantly back and forth throughout the entire game. It's tedious at the best of time, but it feels like a fair old bit of padding to me, and it really doesn't do the game any favours. Moving on to the magazine scores. Amiga CD32 Gamer gave this 90%. I've never even heard of that mag before. I'll have to see if there's any downloads for that. Amiga Action 85%. Amiga Computing 84%. CU Amiga 74%. The One 74%. And finally, and I'm not sure what happened here, Amiga Power at 22%. If you lot want to know why I don't trust Amiga Power, the score for Litil Divil is the perfect reason. I get that an interviewer might not like the game itself, but it's in a very playable state and it's far from being buggy or broken. 22% should rightly be for games that deserve to be flushed down the loo, but this is far from that. By no means is it perfect, but it's certainly not at that sort of level. There's a lot of problems with this for sure, but it also deserves a lot of praise and respect for what they were trying to do. First off, I wish they'd made more effort to have a story in the game, especially beyond the fancy graphics, as they really don't do enough to make it feel more than just basic actions leading the way. One thing that kept coming to mind whilst playing this was, it began to feel like the Amiga's version of a Laserdisc game. The animations and gorgeous artwork really do make it stand out from anything else on the CD32 or the A1200 for that matter, with it mixing the 2D and 3D elements together in a way that fools you into thinking this might just be on a much more powerful system. It's quite a feat to see all these different parts play out. An issue that puzzled me a bit though was the fact that there's so many rooms included and why they didn't just link them all together, instead of taping those maze sections here, there and everywhere. Drop them completely, or even reduce it by a massive margin. Why not just really turn this into a more complicated version of Dragon's Lair, especially for all the rooms it has? As it is, it just feels like they all got a little bit carried away with the general maze design, but bigger doesn't always mean better, and they add very little to the game beyond annoying the player. The controls are a bit hit and miss too. It can be tough to make your way through fast acting puzzles or fights which relying on you pressing a direction or a button then having to wait on how the animation plays out. The game does a good job with the artwork for all of them, but I found myself stuck in far too many places, gritting my teeth through the frustrating parts. It's all very well making some mouth-watering graphical experience, but if the players can't see what's on offer, then what's the point if all that's hidden too far away? Litil Divil is a strong case of style over substance. There's so much to see and do, yet the limited gameplay doesn't do it justice. I don't even think it would have been all that difficult to do something to suit the game. I've said it a fair few times in the past, but I think the designers must have been playing this way too much. They will have explored every nook and cranny, so the game for them loses its difficulty. They probably got used to the controls and worked around them thinking it was okay, but there's clearly a problem here, and I wish they'd gone down another path, or at least included some sort of Q&A testing just to improve it. It pains me to say this, but I really don't like what we ended up with. I wanted to love this. It's dripping with good atmosphere, humour and brilliant ideas, but it just falls short on several levels. We end up with this extraordinary, hellish world, but long, boring sections to walk through over and over again. Just let us see the good stuff and cut out all the wandering. There's fun to be had here for sure, but it really is a struggle to get to it. I'm sorry to say that I can't really recommend anyone go back and play this today. The controls annoyed me enough that I think it's better to watch a playthrough online, rather than really struggle to figure out what to do with them. Also, it means you could skip out all of the maze sections. It's still worth a watch though, because of all those fantastic looking backgrounds and cartoon-like animations. I was half expecting Yosemite Sam to appear in parts of it. I mean, it's sounding more and more like Looney Tunes by the minute. I'm afraid to say this certainly hasn't lived up to my expectations, especially after all these years, and I doubt I will be returning to this one ever again. All I can really finish on is that we've ended up with an average experience at best, needing, well, more time on the drawing board. Honestly, what a shame. That's about all the Litil Divil we have time for in this week's show. If you'd like to drop me a line or comment on anything I've done this week, you can do so over on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama. Drop me a line on @AMIGAramaPod, or even use snail mail and use Lorfarius @AMIGArama.com. If you'd like to help out, I always appreciate iTunes reviews or any other review on your podcast app. If you'd like to offer some support, you can do so over at the Patreon page, which is patreon.com/AMIGArama. Of course, we do need to send out a massive thank you to all the support that we keep getting each and every month. And I always send out a massive thank you because they really do help keep the show going. This week, they are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Dudley from Yes Dezine, Gary Heather, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford from Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jason Warnes, Laurent Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Remsky, Quentin Barnes, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Steve Engeldow. I've been saying his name wrong for ages, I hope that's okay this time. And finally, Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.